Thank you, Sean, for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Institute for what I understand is the first joint meeting of these two young professionals outfits, one for the Institute and the China Young Professionals organisation. It's, I think it's a great idea, and I'm very glad to be here for this occasion. Well, I think Sean has probably said as much about me as needs to be said. I began in China in 1981 when I started Mandarin language training. I went to Beijing in 1982, where one of my colleagues at that time, I see is seated here, Bruce. And of course, in that time, tremendous changes. Don't need in a group like this to talk about the changes. I think you all know that, but 500 million people lifted out of poverty in that time. GDP has increased by at least 19 times and so on. It's a well-known story. China, of course, has become Australia's largest trading partner. Not just for Australia, but virtually all Asian countries. China is now the largest trading partner. And it has, of course, assumed a geopolitical prominence in the region, which I think also is well known here. Sean mentioned that I'm now involved with an Australian company, Sino-Australia, which is developing gas assets in Western China. This is a very exciting thing for a former government official, former diplomat to be involved in, and I have to say it's been a tremendous experience for me because it keeps both my professional and personal interest in China going. This has been a large part of my life for the last 30 plus years. And I think the involvement with Sino-Gas and Energy is also brought a perspective which, to my understanding and thinking about China, which perhaps is more developed now than it was perhaps in the past. And in thinking about this evening's presentation, I was asked to talk about Australia-China relations, big subject. Not sure what more can be said on that that's new. So much has been said over and over again. So I'm not sure that I'll be able to come out with anything that's particularly new, but maybe say something about the sort of approach that Australia should take towards China. And if I could sort of sum it up, if I could put a title to this presentation, it would be Australia-China, just do it. Use that old Nike slogan, and I'll talk more about that as we go on. As we all know, the world is, and understandably, is becoming more and more obsessed with China, the growth of China. I think you could almost say there's a rising China industry. I was looking at a couple of bookshops in Melbourne this past week, and you go into them, and the number of books on rising China, restless empire, when China rules the world. This one I like, Chinese Century, Rising Chinese Economy and its Impact on the Global Economy, the Balance of Power in Your Job, and so on. There's a lot of it. I think you get the drift. And the constant theme in all these books is that China is on the path to recovering its former imperial glory, and the rest of the world, watch out. Some, of course, tell an opposite story, that China can't possibly sustain its current momentum and will falter. Now, all this is fine. Some of these are really good books, and I recommend you read them. But I think we need a bit of a reality check, because one might reasonably wonder, when you absorb all this noise about China, how a small to medium-sized power like Australia can hope to develop a constructive, beneficial relationship with China. The problem with this over-obsession with China and the rising China industry, I think, is that it tends to distort our view of China. It makes it harder for us to develop a normal 21st century relationship. So my main point this evening will be that for Australia, developing and building a constructive relationship with China as it continues to grow its economy, its political and military influence. This is always going to be a challenge for us, but it's certainly not impossible if we pursue sensible approaches and policies. If we focus on the practical, the useful, the achievable, use sensible rhetoric. In other words, treat China in a normal way, as a normal country, then I think we can have a strong, healthy relationship with China. In other words, just do it. Now, of course, there are lots of excellent things that are happening between Australia and China at the moment in our engagement. The Asian White Paper hopefully will produce some good results. The Prime Minister's visit to China, which I think starts tomorrow. It looks as though from media reports that the Prime Minister will seek to raise our strategic dialogue with China. This is something that's fine, we need to work harder on that. As I understand it, we don't want to just be a normal strategic partner of China. China has what it designates as strategic partners with many countries, from some very big and powerful countries to some, small and insignificant countries. But we don't want to be just one of those. We want to be a gold star strategic partner. We want to lay down that our strategic partnership will involve every year senior level meetings with the senior leadership, the foreign minister, defence ministers in both countries. We saw earlier this week Fairfax media breathlessly reporting on a secret China task force whose members comprise the heads of 20 government agencies. No doubt the reality of this is less exciting than the media reports. What surprises me that after decades of close engagement with China, we still apparently need to talk the relationship up with rhetoric about new strategies and so on. And this suggests to me that we haven't quite yet achieved what I would call a normal relationship with China. Now, there are understandable reasons for this, mostly I guess relating to differing and misunderstood mutual perceptions. And it's useful, I think, to sort of think a little bit about these two-way perceptions, how China is seen by others and how China sees other countries. So I think these two-way perceptions are important because they do shape the way China deals with other countries and vice versa. And I think it's particularly important in relation to Australia and the particular issue of Chinese investment in this country, and I'll talk more about that a bit later. So first, how China sees itself. Well, it sees itself as having had a history of humiliation by Western powers, a continuing victim of the West's efforts to contain it. China is on the rise, it's on the right side of history, and it's a benign supporter of harmonious international relations, non-interference in other countries' affairs. The West, and when I say West, principally the United States, I would imagine, I would think that would probably be the way I would put it, sees China in somewhat different ways. It can see the impressive growth, economic growth, social changes, but also sees non-transparency, authoritarian rule, supporter of the liberal causes, human rights transgressor, the stealer of commercial and other secrets, cyber war, unfair trading partner, rapid growth in military expenditure that could lead to conflict, and so on. And one can readily see how these differing perceptions lead to misunderstandings and judgments in China's dealings with other countries. And while it's probably not possible to reconcile these differences, it is important, I think, for all sides to work to narrow them and to understand, first and foremost, that these differences do exist but can be managed effectively without anyone surrendering their key principles and values. In other words, there should be a recognition and acceptance that it's not a battlefield of competing ideologies, but rather a matter of developing workable modes of cooperative international relations. And it's here, I think, that probably Australia can do a bit more. How so, you might ask? Well, let me just talk about two broad areas where I think in the commentary in Australia, much of it focuses on is highlighting conflicts of interest between Australia and China. The first is just, what are China's national interests? Let me just set the scene by saying a few brief words about what China wants, what are its key national interests. I think it has three key goals. First, to complete its economic restructuring and at the same time maintain rapid economic growth. Secondly, to handle the increasing social conflicts in the country against a background of somewhat declining political authority of the Communist Party. And thirdly, to carry out effective diplomacy, protecting its overseas interests peacefully as it continues to rise. And in this regard, it's worth noting that China is in a rather ambivalent and conflicted position in its foreign relations. The international community on the one hand, is demanding that China bear more international responsibilities, but when China does play a bigger role in international affairs, many countries feel nervous. And sort of underpinning these three national interests, of course, the Communist Party of China sees it as fundamental that it, pursuing them, that it maintain its hold on political power. Now, these are three broad national interests, and I would contend that in principle none of them is incompatible or in conflict with Australia's interests. Indeed, at least one of them, achieving economic modernisation, is very much consistent with our interests. So just on that basis alone, we have a good basis for a good relationship. The second area where there's perceived area of potential conflict is this vexed issue of whether we have to choose between China or the United States, which you hear so many times. And I believe that this is a simplistic and self-defeating question to pose. The US-China relationship is the most important in the world today and will remain so for the foreseeable future. It's an incredibly complex relationship with current exchanges and dialogues between the two countries in just about every area imaginable at an all-time high, despite the impression that you might gain from those who talk about potential conflict between the two. And in this complex and dynamic environment, there is, I believe, ample room for Australia to develop a good relationship with China. The picture is not as gloomy as some would have us believe. And I don't think there's any, for China's part, I don't think there's any doubt that China wants a stable and cooperative relationship with the United States as the best means to achieve its modernisation. At the same time, China also believes that it's US policies that are causing distrust, and it sees the US as interfering in its domestic affairs and trying to prevent it from becoming a great power. This is a pretty deep-seated feeling in China. Since, say, 2008, China has certainly come to see itself in a considerably strong position vis-à-vis the United States. It sees itself as having become a first-class power and should be so recognised, in particular by the US. It's successfully weathered both the Asian financial crisis of the late 90s and the more recent global financial crisis. It has surpassed Japan as the second largest economy. It successfully held the 2008 Olympics and 2010 Shanghai Expo. It's got space projects, major weapons advances and so on. And all of these were China's achievements. These were not ones that were dependent on the US or the international community. At the same time, it sees that the US is in a decline, relatively, although the top leadership, I believe, are sober-minded enough to understand that the US is a very resilient country, and they have not concluded that US superpower status is seriously challenged, at least as of now. In fact, a serious US decline would hurt China quite significantly. But the power gap has narrowed, there's no question of that. China also thinks that its model of economic development is more successful, a better model for developing countries. The so-called Beijing consensus, where an all-powerful leadership effectively manages economic and social affairs, is seen as a better alternative to Western democracy in developing countries. And this is something that Chinese believe very fervently, and a number of developing countries would probably also agree with it. For the US, it's the way it approaches China. I don't believe that strategic distrust of China is the current dominant view among national decision makers in the US government. I think the consensus view in Washington, as I understand it, is that the US and China should be able to adopt policies that will lead to the sort of long-term relationship commensurate with ties between two basically cooperative major powers. And this is quite an optimistic view, certainly not one that's based on any expectation that military conflict is likely. Sure, there'll be frictions, but where they're not ones that can provide win-win outcomes for everyone, they can be managed more or less effectively. At the same time, the US is hedging its bets. The decision makers there also see China's future as very undetermined, as uncertain. So while the overall view is optimistic, there is also clear recognition that it may be necessary to be able to cope with the possibility that things could move in a different direction. Hence the Asia pivot policy announced by President Obama in late 2011. So the challenge for the US is how to promote desired Chinese behaviour, but without exacerbating Chinese fears that the US is trying to contain it. While this is a challenging objective, it's not an insuperable one if pursued sensibly and pragmatically, and in no way requires, as some are arguing in this country, major changes to Australian foreign policy. In other words, I believe that we can work within those sorts of objectives within more or less the existing framework of Australian foreign policy. Turning to Australia specifically, as I've already noted, China's national interests are not in principle in conflict with ours, and indeed in some respects are in lockstep with Australian interests. But the question is still there is, can a small or medium-sized country like Australia deal effectively and successfully with a country as large and complex as China? Now, in my view, the answer is undoubtedly yes, but we need to look at and deal with China more and more as a normal country with which we can have a normal relationship. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, first and foremost, it means that in our dealings with China, we should treat it as we would any other major country with which we have important relations, or perhaps more to the point, any normal big power that is on the way to becoming a great power. We should approach China on the basis that its overwhelming priorities are domestic ones. For example, last year, a person from the Communist Party Central School, the deputy editor of a major journal there associated with the Communist Party, wrote an article on 10 grave problems facing China. Foreign policy and diplomacy were listed as number 9 in that 10. Now his was one view. Not all Chinese would necessarily agree with that, but I think it is illustrative that when Chinese leaders wake up in the morning, domestic issues are more likely on their mind than diplomatic issues. Treating China in a normal way also means we must treat China with respect, acknowledge and accept that its size and economic achievements mean that it will have a position of influence and power in the Asian region, including greater military strength. This is normal. At the same time, let's not focus too much on trying to build special or strategic relationships, as though achieving some sort of ranking in Chinese eyes as a strategic partner is essential to Australian interests. I think this makes us look like the demandeur, which diminishes us as a nation and in the eyes of the Chinese. Why not just work calmly, quietly, pragmatically on developing a strong and mutually useful and beneficial relationship? This, of course, means having extensive regular dialogue exchanges between Australia and China at all levels. I'd certainly like to see more Australia-savvy people in government who can craft the rhetoric about China in more sensible terms than is often the case. I don't think we have too many Asia-savvy people in the current government, and to be fair, I'm not sure in the opposition we have a lot of Asia-savvy people. I think this is something we'd like to see over time change. Business, which is often much maligned, I think generally does better than government in this area, but we still need to ensure that better signals about our relations with China get out to a wider audience. And treating the relationship with China as a normal one doesn't mean we accept everything that China does in its relationships. That would clearly be silly. Indeed, would not be treating China as a normal country or even a normal great power. Along with other countries in our region, we have an interest in China not overplaying its hand. As an ally of the US, we will continue working with the latter to encourage China not to overplay its hand. And while I'm not necessarily convinced that the rhetoric that Australia and the US used in handling the recent US pivot towards Asia, I nonetheless think that the fundamentals of this policy were appropriate. And that said, getting the rhetoric right with China is almost as important as getting the substantive policy right. We should also understand and accept that just as there are many different voices in Western countries, China too is no longer a single voice, a monolithic entity. Sometimes we hear quite provocative comments from Chinese scholars and PLA officers, serving or retired. And we should take note of these, but not see them as necessarily reflecting a single view, and nor should we overreact to these. And also, along with our regional neighbours, we don't want the United States to behave in ways that makes China a more dangerous neighbour. A part of dealing with China as a normal country is that we should accept that while Chinese institutions and systems are different from ours, this doesn't mean that they are intrinsically opposed to our interests. And this is especially important in the area of business, where we should start from the basic principle that Chinese organisations, especially businesses, have normal legitimate objectives to make profits and grow their companies rather than be driven by some unknown Beijing-led agenda. And here I'd like to turn to the domestic Australian aspects of China's involvement with Australia, in particular the area of Chinese investment in Australia, which is so important to our economic development, but where recently, I believe, some wrong signals have been sent to the Chinese. And I want to draw on the issue of Chinese investment in Australia almost as a case study, because unlike normal trade, foreign investment is much more deeply involved in the economy and culture of the recipient, and as such can arouse great passions and sensitivity. Moreover, it is critical in building further trade links. Foreign investment influences and is influenced by mutual perceptions, trust and confidence, and how we deal with it gets to the essence in many ways of how we develop relations with a country like China, not just in the investment field, but into a far broader spectrum. There's been much negative publicity in Australia surrounding Chinese investment, much of it based on populist beat-ups in the media and by some politicians. Examples, the Huawei, the question of agricultural investment. There's been quite a lot of contradictory commentary on whether Australia is losing ground in attracting Chinese foreign investment, or whether we're actually doing well. The argument can go either way based on current statistics. The glass is either half full or half empty. And we look at Chinese investment in Australia. Let's look at a few facts. On the positive side, Australia remains the largest recipient of Chinese foreign investment, but only just. Stiff competition for this ranking is coming from the US, Canada and Brazil. The latter have captured more mega mergers and acquisitions in recent years. Canada notably with the $15 billion deal last year to acquire Nexen, Canadian oil and gas company. And China's global foreign investment is still small compared with other countries, only 1.7% of the global total, but it is growing. Its share of foreign investment in Australia is way behind that of other countries, such as US, UK, Japan, Singapore, Canada, and a number of European countries. Only around 3% of total foreign investment in Australia in last year was Chinese. That said, while it's still small in absolute terms, it has risen quite quickly from a low base, and this seems to have frightened some people. Most of it, as you know, most of Chinese investment, as you know, is in minerals and energy. The proportion in farms and agriculture is absolutely minute. On the negative side, Australia has more what I'd call troubled deals in other countries, such as Canada and the US. Troubled deals, those that fail because of either commercial or regulatory official approval reasons. Often the two become a bit blurred. It further confuses the debate in this country. And while we remain the number one destination for Chinese investment, we are slipping, and it may be difficult to hold on to this ranking. In a number of countries, including but not only Australia, Chinese investment has become an emotive and rather highly charged target in popular commentary. In Australia at times, the policy response to the surge of Chinese foreign investment has, I believe, been clumsy and unsophisticated. The FIRB has introduced new investment guidelines to deal with the rush of investment from Chinese state-owned enterprises, but this seems to have largely occurred on an ad hoc basis. New foreign investment guidelines here single out proposals from state-owned enterprises for special scrutiny. The delay in considering Chinalco's bid to buy into Rio Tinto a few years back, for example, saw the bid fall over in the end commercially, but raised questions in China about Australia's investment regime. Australian security agencies have recently restricted the business dealings of the telecommunications giant Huawei Technologies, which is a big player internationally, increasingly in Australia too. Whatever the issues, and I don't claim to know them all, this seemed a strange and clumsy interference in the economic policy making processes, and again the handling of it and the way it was explained, I think, sent some very odd signals to China. There have also been reports last year of Chinese investors suspending investments in magnetite projects in Western Australia, and the suspension or delay of further investment activities by the leading mining company Sino-Australia. Now, these may be due to commercial factors such as rising costs, but taking all of these developments together, it seems likely that China will be having a second look at Australia as a favourable investment destination. We won't be able to maintain our number one ranking for Chinese investment unless Australia's drift on foreign investment policy is halted and our approach becomes more sophisticated. And much of the political confusion in the debate in Australia on Chinese investment, which has no doubt played into Chinese perceptions of Australian policy, has resulted from the at times I would regard as hysterical populist reaction in some parts of the Australian community towards Chinese buying our farms, adversely affecting our food security and water supplies, and the fact that many of the Chinese companies investing in large projects are, as I've mentioned, state-owned enterprises. Now, it's true that concerns about Chinese investment are amplified by the fact that Chinese state-owned enterprises tend to seek much higher equity stakes than, for example, sovereign wealth funds from countries like Singapore. And they also tend to manage more directly commercial operations. Chinese foreign investment can also potentially raise more concerns about vertical integration and the potential for transfer pricing and all those sorts of things. But much of the concern, I think, underlying it all is that the state-owned enterprises will pursue hidden non-commercial agendas cooked up in Beijing rather than pursue strictly commercial interests. What the public debate here often overlooks in relation to investment by Chinese state-owned enterprises is that all companies operating in Australia, whether they are Australian or Chinese or from any other country, are bound by Australian company law. If any firm breaks the law, it'll be punished. Moreover, the history and the role and the evolution of state-owned enterprises in China and their relationship with the Chinese government need to be better understood in this country. There is less government influence over state-owned enterprises than many believe, and most are run on a completely commercial basis. Many are serious international players, and I can attest to that from the partners that we have in Sino-Gas, two of the largest state-owned enterprises in China, China Petroleum and China National Offshore Oil Corporation, and they run, from our perspective and our dealings with them, strictly commercial, very professional, very well managed, impressive companies. The 2011 Asia Society report said that China's firms typically put self-interest and profitability above all else. And the Chinese National Development and Reform Commission, which approves state-owned enterprise applications for large overseas foreign investment transactions, now has a heightened focus on commerciality and risk management. It may be true that, and even some Chinese would concede this, that the state-owned enterprises, when they're actually operating in China, need to take into account broader Chinese government policies, such as maintaining employment and regional expansion. But even critics of Chinese state-owned enterprises operating offshore struggle to find examples of non-commercial behaviour, although they emphasise always the potential for such behaviour. So it's the fear of it that we seem to be most concerned about, but we don't have much evidence to back it up. In the highly charged political atmosphere in Australia these days, I don't know how we can avoid emotional, populist and unhelpful public commentary on Chinese foreign investment, other than to hope that more mature and responsible comment by political leaders and public commentators will get the message across that, one, Australia needs Chinese investment, as we have always needed foreign investment. Two, we have laws and a regulatory regime in place that we can be confident will protect Australian interests. And three, Chinese state-owned enterprises are not sinister entities following some insidious political agenda crafted by the Communist Party in Beijing. In fact, they are driven by normal business criteria, and if they fail commercially, their executives will be out of a job. Now, we cannot expect to capture new Chinese markets without the links that Chinese foreign investment provides. Given the importance of Australian resources and energy products to China, I would argue that if we don't get this right, we will not achieve the mutual trust and mutual confidence in other areas of the relationship which are essential as we build it. In short, if we don't get foreign investment right with the Chinese, this will significantly influence how China perceives us and deals with us, not just an investment on a full range of interests affecting the relationship. So in conclusion, I think there are big issues at stake in Australia pursuing a sensible, pragmatic and normal approach to its relations with China. It's not impossible, indeed we must do it. The basis of doing so successfully is not to build up, in my view, grand, contrived strategies, but to approach China as a normal entity, albeit still evolving in terms of its understanding and adherence to international practices, but learning very fast. Of course, there is uncertainty about where China is heading into the future. No one knows for sure what the China of the future will look like. The Chinese themselves don't know. But for the rest of the world, we should not assume the worst and turn our fears into self-fulfilling prophecies. Thank you.